Starting out woodworking can be pretty overwhelming, and I know I'd probably do things a little differently if I had to start over as a beginner woodworker. One thing I would definitely change are the types of projects I built when I was starting out. So in this video, I'm going to build what I think is a perfect beginner furniture project, a project that'll teach you most of the woodworking fundamentals you really need to know, and I'm going to build it using only what I consider to be beginner tools. So I started the project by breaking down a sheet of this red oak plywood, which I used for the main carcass of the coffee table. And one big tip I have for beginners is to embrace using plywood. It's usually a lot easier to work with than hardwood since it's already flat and square, and it can be bought at pretty much any big box store. That said, I'd probably skip the construction grade plywood because you'll likely end up with sheets that look more like Pringles than plywood, and you'll also run into a ton of voids and surface defects compared to something like cabinet grade plywood. You might also look around for cabinet shops or lumber suppliers in your area because you can probably get higher quality plywood at those places for not much more than the big box store stuff. I broke down my plywood into large sections with an inexpensive track saw and job site table saw, both of which are, in my opinion, absolute must-buys when getting into woodworking. While you can technically get started woodworking with a circular saw, it's going to make the whole process much more frustrating and just generally less enjoyable. Circular saws just really aren't designed for super precise work, and getting them to work like a track saw is a real struggle. Instead, I just pick up this cheap Win track saw, which is about the same price as a decent circular saw anyway. And compared to a circular saw, a track saw makes things like accurately breaking down sheet goods or ripping perfectly straight edges on boards much easier, plus your lungs will thank you for the improved dust collection. Now, you might like the look of exposed plywood edges, and if that's the case, you could skip this next step, but I decided to dress up my plywood a little bit by adding some hardwood edge banding. And this is one of those techniques that really levels up the quality of your pieces, and the process of adding this edge banding is really simple. First, I ripped some 1/8" strips of hardwood, ash in this case, down at the table saw, and a dedicated ripping blade makes this process go a lot smoother on this kind of job site table saw, since it significantly reduces the strain on the fairly underpowered motor. Installing the edge banding is also super simple. I just added glue to the edge banding and clamped it in place with some painter's tape. And painter's tape is really all you need here, and if you kind of stretch the tape while you're applying it, you'll be surprised at how much pressure it can generate. Also, you might think this is going to be a huge coffee table based on the size of these panels, but these panels are actually made up of the top or bottom panels plus the coffee table sides and dividers. And applying the edge banding to these larger panels will make flush trimming this edge banding later much easier. Plus, I think it makes things easier when you don't have to mess with a ton of smaller edge banding pieces. Speaking of flush trimming, once the glue dried, I could go ahead and flush trim the edge banding on the panels. Flushing up the ends of the edge banding was easy with a cheap flush trim saw, but those edges can be a little bit more challenging. I've used a router for this in the past, but it's really easy to dig into the face of the plywood if you're not careful, plus dust gets absolutely everywhere. Thankfully, there's a better way to do this. So as you might have seen in my last video, I built this simple jig for my table saw, which makes this process a breeze. And this table saw jig was a lot easier to use, and best of all, it made it impossible to dig into the surface of the plywood. Once both panels were flush trimmed, I could break the panels down into the individual pieces, again using my track saw. Next, I needed to add edge banding to the ends of the top and bottom panels since they'd be visible in the finished table, and I just repeated the process to add the edge banding to those areas. While that glue dried, I could cut the coffee table sides and dividers down to final size, making sure to remove the slightly ragged edge left by the track saw since this piece was the offcut from the larger panels. With all the cabinet pieces cut to size, I could move on to the joinery, and I think this is another spot where beginners really struggle. So most beginner projects tend to lean on simpler joinery like pocket screws or even face screws, but I think the sooner you rip off the band-aid of trying some better joinery options, the faster you'll progress as a woodworker. So for this cabinet, I decided to use one of the most useful basic joinery techniques, the dado and rabbet, or rebate as it's called abroad. And you might think cutting accurate dados would require an expensive dado stack or specialty router bit, but thankfully there's a router jig for that. So I saw this jig on the DIY Montreal channel, and it's a super clever design. All you need to build it is 4 pieces of plywood, a few carriage bolts, and some kind of knob that works with your bolts. And the length of these longer plywood strips will depend on the width of your panel, and you can easily cut multiple of these strips to work with different panel widths. You can see by sliding these boards back and forth, it changes the width of this slot. And so all we have to do is take one of our dividers, set it in the middle here, push our jig up tight against the divider, and then we can just tighten down our knobs, and that's going to leave us with a perfect area that's going to match the thickness of our panels dead on. Before using the jig, I needed to mark the location of the dados on one of the panels, and I used the other panel to assist in marking my lines here. Next, I clamped the jig in place, lining up the inside of the jig with my layout line. This jig is designed to work with a template bit, so I got one installed in my trim router, and after setting my depth, I could get to routing, making the cut in 2 passes. The bearing on the template bit rides along the jig, and since I set the width of the jig with the exact plywood I'm using, I knew the fit would be absolutely perfect, and as you can see, it was. All right, now the moment of truth, the test fit. Oh yeah. Nice and snug. That looks really, really good. Nice and tight. That said, I had a little chip out on the edge banding on this first pass, which was thankfully an easy fix, and I also have a tip to avoid that. So instead of pushing the router out through the edge banding, I lifted the bit and made what's called a climb cut, where I'm technically running the router in the wrong direction. This climb cut pushes the wood fibers towards the edge banding rather than away from it, and this completely eliminated any chipping. Let's take a second to talk about the sponsor of this week's video, Surfshark VPN. So in case you're not familiar with them, VPNs, or virtual private networks, keep your online activity private by encrypting your data so it can't be found by snoopers or trackers. So I personally use a VPN pretty much all the time, but it's especially important when using public Wi-Fi, as your information can easily be accessed. VPNs are also great for accessing region-locked content, so if your favorite show or sport happens to be on a streaming platform abroad, you can easily watch it with Surfshark. Thankfully, using Surfshark is super simple. You just install the app on your mobile device or computer, and then you can select which server Surfshark routes your traffic through. The Surfshark One package includes even more privacy tools like ad blockers, data breach alerts, and alternative ID, which allows you to easily create proxy email addresses to hide your personal info from scammers. So if you want to start protecting your personal data today, go to surfshark.com/craftedworkshop or use coupon code craftedworkshop to get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN for free. Thanks again to Surfshark for sponsoring this week's video, and let's get back to work. I could repeat the process to cut the rabbets at each end of the panel, and the setup was a little tricky here since the jig was overhanging the panel, but I got it figured out, and thankfully the cut went smoothly. I repeated the process at the other end of the panel, and with that, all of the joinery was cut on this first panel, so now all I needed to do was cut the same joinery on the other panel. And rather than trying to measure out the exact locations of the dados and rabbets again, I just transferred the locations from one panel to another using a small square. And this kind of referential measuring is another huge pro tip for beginners. Anytime you can avoid measuring, you should. Measuring inevitably introduces error, whether that's from you actually measuring wrong or just marking on the wrong side of your line. Instead, using some kind of reference like the actual piece you're working on will result in much more accurate work. Once I transferred the locations from the first panel, I got the dados and rabbets cut on the second panel, and the joinery for the cabinet was done. Next up was the glue up, and before adding any glue, I always do a dry fit on projects like this, and during the dry fit, I could make sure everything was coming together nicely, and I also labeled the pieces in the orientation I wanted them in the finished piece. I also went ahead and sanded the inside faces of the cabinet, since these spots would have been really hard to reach after assembly. So one downside to using dados and rabbets is that you kind of need a mountain of clamps if you want to assemble the entire project in one go. Thankfully, I have a veritable Everest of clamps here, but if you don't, you can easily pre-drill and add some screws to the bottom side of the cabinet since they won't be visible in the finished piece. And those screws would act as clamps while the glue dries, and you could even remove them afterwards and fill the screw holes if you wanted. I skipped the screws, which meant I needed to go kind of nuts with the clamps, and also made sure to clean up any squeeze out with a damp rag before leaving the glue to dry overnight. While the glue dried, I could turn my attention to the coffee table base, which I made out of 6/4 or roughly 1 inch thick ash. And I love working with ash because I think it looks great, especially with the black finish I'm going to be adding later on. Ash is also usually super cheap, at least here in the US, making it a great choice when you're getting started. Unfortunately, the reason ash is so cheap is thanks to the emerald ash borer, an invasive beetle which is killing millions of ash trees here in the US. The silver lining is that ash is extremely inexpensive and shares a lot of characteristics with another popular open grain hardwood, white oak, which I'll be using for the drawer fronts on this project. Anyway, I rough cut my parts to size, all of which had a 15-degree angle cut onto the ends, and after a quick test assembly, I could start cutting the joinery. So to connect the legs to the long stretchers, I called on another classic joinery method, the half lap. And seeing these angles might stress you out a little bit, but thankfully the setup couldn't have been more simple, since I could cut all of the half laps with my miter gauge set to the same 15-degree angle. And since a dado stack wasn't part of my beginner tool list, I just made these cuts in multiple passes, and most importantly, before cutting, I installed a blade with a flat top grind. And this blade left me with perfectly clean half laps without the ridges you'd see if you tried to use a ATB or alternate top bevel blade. I repeated the process on one of the legs, and as you can see, the resulting half lap was just about perfect and just needed a little bit of sanding to clean up. With my setup dialed in, I got the rest of the half laps cut, again using the same initial setup for all of the parts. After cutting, I got the pieces dry fit and everything was looking great. So now I could get the half laps cut into the center of the stretchers, which is how the two stretchers would connect. And the angle these stretchers intersected at was pretty arbitrary, and I decided on roughly 53 degrees when modeling the project in SketchUp. Once again, I spent some time on the layout, making sure the half laps were centered and in the right orientation, and then I could get them cut at the table saw. After the initial cut, I needed to dial in the depth of the half lap just a little bit so the stretchers would end up flush. And once I did that, the half laps and all of the joinery for this coffee table was done. Nice, there we go. Beautiful. Next, I wanted to cut a taper on the legs, and this taper really helped to lighten the look of the legs and made them look like they were splayed at a sharper angle than they actually were. So another jig I covered in my last video was this simple tapering jig, which is just a few scraps glued and screwed together. And this jig made quick work of the tapering, and I ended up with 4 perfectly tapered legs. With that done, I could go ahead and get the base glued up, starting with the stretchers. And I didn't go crazy with the glue here to try and avoid squeeze out, and after assembling the stretchers, I could add the legs. Thankfully, this was a very low stress glue up compared to assembling the cabinet, since none of these parts really interacted with each other, so I could really take my time getting each piece seated. I also cleaned up any squeeze out along the way with a wet rag. Once the glue dried, I went ahead and got the base attached to the cabinet, which was as easy as centering it on the bottom of the cabinet, pre-drilling and countersinking some holes, and then driving in some screws. The coffee table was really starting to take shape at this point. I think it's pretty cool you can build furniture like this with such basic tools. So if you want to see a deep dive on all of the details on this coffee table, including over 3 hours of video instruction, plus detailed plans, I'd love for you to check out my new woodworking course, Jumpstart Your Woodworking. This Woodworking 101 style course was built based on my decade of woodworking trial and error, and I basically made the course I wished had existed when I was getting started on my woodworking journey years ago. The course includes way more than just this coffee table build though. I have another entire series covering building this workbench as part of the course. We'll also go over designing projects, including some SketchUp basics and much more. Best of all, I kept the tools I used on the builds to an absolute minimum based on my essential tools list, so you should be able to follow along at home in your shop, even if you're limited on tools. My Jumpstart Your Woodworking course is on sale from now until August 10th, with the price reduced by 30%. So if you want to grab it now at this heavily discounted price, check it out now by clicking the link in the video description below or scanning the QR code, and thanks so much for your support. I went ahead and added some wood filler to the coffee table since there were a few spots with some gaps, and then I can move on to building the drawers. I built these drawers using some leftover 1/2-inch pre-finished plywood, and I started by breaking down the pieces at the table saw using that panel sled I built in my last video to cross-cut the parts to length. Next, I needed to cut the joinery for the drawer boxes, and these are a bit of a different style than I typically build because I wanted to show how to build drawer boxes with no visible fasteners without using a pocket hole jig. And let's hop into SketchUp to see how these pieces come together before showing how I actually cut them. So as you can see, there's a rabbet cut on the ends of the drawer box front and back, which is housed in a dado on the inside face of the drawer sides. The drawer bottom is also housed in a groove, which is cut into the inside faces of the drawer box parts. So I saw this joinery technique on the Stumpy Nubs channel, and it's basically a lock rabbet joint, but the trick is you can cut all of the joints with this same setup, which really simplifies the process. The only difference in my case is I had to make a second pass to widen all the joints since I wasn't using a dado stack, but otherwise this was a really simple process. So I set my blade height to 1/4 inch, which is half the thickness of my 1/2 inch plywood, and then set my fence to the same 1/4 inch distance. I also went ahead and added my edge banding jig with the tall extension drop down so it was flush with the table, and this helped to support the pieces I was running on end, which you'll see in a second. The first rabbet to cut was on the ends of the drawer box front and backs. And then I cut the groove on the inside of the drawer box parts to house the bottom panel. Next, I cut the same rabbet on the edges of the drawer bottoms since I wanted them to fit in the 1/4 inch groove, and they're obviously 1/2 inch thick. Then finally, I cut the dados on the inside faces of the drawer box sides. Once the first pass was cut on all the parts, I could bump the fence over to widen all the joints to 1/4 inch, and after doing a little tweaking to get a good fit, I ran the second pass on all the pieces. After cutting, I had a few fuzzy bits left that I cleaned up with a chisel, and I also evidently tilted one of the pieces while cutting, which left the corner of the rabbet a little bit proud. This was also easy to fix with the chisel, and this is a Japanese chisel from Suizan, which I've been really impressed with considering the price. Once that was cleaned up, I could do a quick dry fit, and thankfully everything was looking good, so I could go ahead and get the drawer boxes glued up. And as you can see, one of the perks of using pre-finished plywood is it's super easy to wipe away any squeeze out without staining the surface, and these drawer boxes came together like a breeze since the pieces all locked together. And I think I might start using this joinery method more for my drawer boxes because the assembly process was just so much easier than when using pocket screws. While the glue dried, I could go ahead and cut the drawer fronts to rough size from some 4/4 white oak, and I'd be using these drawer fronts during the drawer box installation. Before installing the drawer boxes, I went ahead and sanded down the edges of the coffee table so I had a nice even reference surface when installing the drawers. So these drawers are inset, which meant I needed to use one of the drawer fronts to set that inset distance, which was 3/4 inch in my case. I installed the drawer slides in the opening using a combination square to set the inset distance, and I used a self-centering drill bit to make sure the slide didn't move around while I was pre-drilling the holes. And there we go. Next, I could get the drawer boxes installed, and I started by adding a few pieces of 1/4 inch plywood below the drawer box to act as spacers, and then I just slowly slid the drawer out little by little, adding screws as I went. And I think this is by far the easiest method to install side-mounted slides. There's no measuring or marking layout lines, and as long as the end of the slide is flush with the front of the drawer box, your drawer should work perfectly. After adding the drawer, I double-checked the fit with the drawer front, and it was thankfully looking perfect, so next I could get the handles cut into the drawer fronts. And I definitely could have freehanded this, but I decided to whip up a quick template, which just made it easier to get the handles matching perfectly. To cut the template, I just cut a 45-degree angle at my layout marks, then connected the cuts by slowly raising the table saw blade, making a plunge cut. And this can be dangerous if you're not careful, and definitely don't try this if you're not comfortable with this kind of cut. The nice thing about this plunge cut was it left me with a perfectly straight bottom to the handle cutout, something that would have been a lot more difficult with something like a jigsaw. I glued and screwed on a few blocks to act as edge guides. Then I marked a center line on the jig along with both of the drawer fronts before marking out where I needed to remove the waste. I used a jigsaw to do this, making sure to stay proud of my layout lines by about 1/8 inch. I clamped the template in place, and then I could get to flush trimming, again using that same trim router. Another big pro tip I have for you beginners out there is to invest in good quality router bits. And I'd highly recommend using a spiral flush trim bit for pretty much all of your flush trimming work. A flush trim bit with straight cutters will definitely work, but it'll also usually cause a lot more tear out, especially on this kind of project, since I was routing in grain on those angled parts of the handles. I repeated the process on the other drawer front, then I chamfered all the edges of the drawer fronts to soften the edges, since your hands will be pulling on the edges of the drawer fronts when opening the drawers. With that done, the drawer fronts were looking good, so I went ahead and installed them on the drawer boxes. And I used the playing card trick to center the drawer fronts in the openings, and this is by far the easiest way to perfectly center a drawer front, in my opinion. I repeated the process on the other drawer front, and with that done, I could turn around and uninstall the drawers so I could get everything prepped for finishing. And this is definitely one of the more annoying parts of woodworking, and I guess you could wait to install the drawers and drawer fronts until after finishing, but the last thing you want to do is accidentally damage one of your parts after finishing. And that's why I typically fit all of my hardware prior to finishing. Once everything was disassembled, I could get the cabinet fully prepped for finish, starting by sanding with 120 grit. Next, I wanted to add a chamfer to all the edges, and this chamfer will both break the edges, but will also help to blend that hardwood edge banding with the plywood. To really maximize this effect, I set my chamfer depth so it was just proud of the seam between the edge banding and the plywood, and after a little sanding, the chamfer blends this seam perfectly, and it really makes the whole thing look like it's one piece. And this is why I really prefer hardwood edge banding on projects like this, because iron-on edge banding is nowhere near thick enough to do this kind of thing. I chamfered all of the edges of the cabinet, including the front edges, and I did need to come back and clean up those corners with a chisel since the chamfer bit couldn't reach those areas. After chamfering, I sanded the entire cabinet with 180 grit, which was my final grit in this case. Then I blew off any leftover dust before setting it aside. Next, I could get the base prep for finish, and I started with 80 grit on the base since I needed to flush up some of those half laps. And this base was a little awkward to sand, and I actually think waiting to glue the two stretchers together would have made this process a whole lot easier. Anyway, I added the same chamfer to the base and worked my way up through 120 and 180 grit, which is where I stopped. Finally, I could repeat the same process on the drawer fronts, working my way up through the grits and hand sanding the chamfers to smooth them out. With all that done, it was finally time for finishing, and as I mentioned earlier, I went with a black finish on the cabinet and base and a clear finish on the drawer fronts. And I've used a bunch of different black finishes in the past, but I think my favorite has got to be this Enduro tinted polyurethane from General Finishes. It's easy to apply, and the final look is awesome, especially on open grain woods like this ash and oak. So I started the finishing work by adding the clear coat since I didn't want any black finish from my gloves ending up on the drawer fronts. And I used General Finishes High Performance, which is a water-based polyurethane, and I love this finish on oak because it doesn't tint or yellow the wood at all. After applying the clear, I wrapped the leftover finish with a plastic bag to keep it from drying out between coats. Then I could move on to the black finish. And applying this finish was pretty straightforward. I just rolled on a light coat, making sure to clean up any drips or sags with the foam brush. I repeated the process on the base, and then I let the first coat dry for about an hour before moving on to the second coat, which was just more of the same. I left the finish to dry overnight, and then I could come back and level the finished surfaces with some 320 grit sandpaper. And I wasn't looking to remove much material here, I just wanted to smooth out any nibs or small finish inconsistencies before the third and final coat. I made sure to remove all the dust by vacuuming and wiping the surfaces with a damp rag, then I could apply one last light coat on all of the parts. And with that, all that was left to do was reassemble everything, and then I could call the coffee table done. So hopefully this project inspired you to try building some higher quality furniture and move on from the very basics. And I think if you do, you'll be surprised at just how quick your work will progress. And I know for me, there was a pretty distinct turning point in my woodworking where I stopped building janky pallet furniture and started building better quality stuff, most of which I still have and use over 8 years later. So again, if you want a ton more detail on this build, check out my course, Jumpstart Your Woodworking, which is on sale for 30% off now until August 10th. Thanks again for watching, and until next week, happy building.